On a February day in 1997, the silence of the small coastal town of Hastings, located in the southeast of England, was broken by news that soon shocked not only local residents, but the whole country. On February 15th, a 13-year-old girl, Billie-Jo Jenkins, was found brutally murdered in the yard of her foster family's house. This murder did not just shock the public, it caused a storm of emotions, disappointment, and controversy as subsequent events exposed the problems of the judicial system and left many in doubt as to who was actually responsible for this tragedy. Billie-Jo lived at the home of her adoptive father, Zion Jenkins, his wife Lois, and 4 foster sisters. She, like many children at her age, seemed like an ordinary girl, energetic, cheerful, with good relationships with friends and teachers. No one could have predicted that at one point her life would be so cruelly cut short, and this event would become the starting point of a complex and controversial court case. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon, and the family was going about their daily business. However, after lunch, Zion Jenkins, the father of the family, returned home with his younger daughters to find Billie-Jo lying on the ground in the yard of the house. She was covered in blood, her head was smashed, and there was a metal tent peg nearby. Calling an ambulance, Jenkins desperately tried to save the girl, but it was too late. Hastings, a city with a rich history and a calm atmosphere, has become the center of media attention. There was talk everywhere about who could have committed this terrible crime. The most unexpected people came under suspicion. The press hyped every detail, and the Jenkins family found themselves under constant pressure from public opinion. The case of Billie-Jo Jenkins not only became a tragedy for her loved ones, but also caused a deep resonance in British society, raising questions about how justice works, what are the limits of trust in legal procedures, and whether an innocent person can be wrongly convicted of such a terrible crime. Billie-Jo Jenkins was born in 1983 and faced difficulties in early childhood. Her biological family was unable to provide her with proper living conditions, and she ended up in foster care. It happened when she was about 9 years old. Her adoptive parents, Zion and Lois Jenkins, had already raised 4 daughters, but Billie-Jo quickly joined their family, becoming an older foster sister to other girls. Billie-Jo was a bright and energetic girl with big plans for the future. She attended a local school and, according to teachers, was an able and kind-hearted student. She was fascinated by art and music. She showed interest in painting and planned, when she grew up, to connect her life with creativity. She was surrounded by friends at school and was popular, although at times she could seem a little withdrawn and dreamy, which was explained by her difficult past. Billie was special. There was always something more in her eyes than just childish joy, one of her teachers recalled. She was smart and attentive, always ready to help friends. The Jenkins family lived in a fairly spacious house on Proletarian Street in Hastings. This city, located on the south coast of England, was known for its historical significance and beautiful seascapes, but also suffered from social inequality. Some neighborhoods were dysfunctional, and although the Jenkins house was located in a good neighborhood, the overall social situation in the city at times left much to be desired. Nevertheless, the family led a fairly ordinary life. Zion worked as a teacher and was actively involved in social activities, while Lois ran the household and took care of the children. Despite the fact that Billie-Jo seemed quite adapted to life in a foster family, there was not always an impeccable relationship between her and Zion Jenkins. There were occasional disagreements and tense moments, although according to Lois and other family members, it was common for a teenager going through a difficult youth. The children in the family were brought up within a strict framework of discipline, and Zion was known for his strict approach to parenting. One of Billie-Jo's close friends told me sometimes Billie complained that it was difficult for her to find a common language with Zion. She said he was too strict, but she never thought it was anything serious. Outwardly, it seemed that Zion cares about the well-being of the children and strives to give them the best. In her relations with her foster sisters, Billie-Jo was friendly, although from time to time there were conflicts between them, as often happens in large families. Her younger sisters recalled that she loved to spend time alone, especially in the backyard of the house, where she often painted and dreamed of the future. Her creative nature largely determined her character, and there was a certain romantic thoughtfulness in her. However, behind this bright image of a teenager, there was something that would be important in the course of the subsequent investigation. There were difficulties in Billie-Jo's life that few people knew about. The transition from one family to another, despite the well-being of the foster family, could not pass without a trace for her emotional state. The girl's inner feelings, her past traumas, and the inability to fully reunite with her biological parents created that hidden tension, which may have played a role in the fatal event. This complex portrait of a teenager, intelligent, sensitive, but at times withdrawn, added even more questions when police began investigating her surroundings after the murder. After all, at first glance, nothing foreshadowed such a terrible tragedy. Saturday morning, February 15, 1997, began quietly at the Jenkins house. The family lived according to the usual routine. The children went about their business, Zion planned a business trip, and Lois was away participating in an event related to her work. Billie-Jo also spent this day, like many previous ones, at home. Her classes and plans for the day did not portend trouble. She was going to continue the housework she had started the day before. In the afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., Zion and his two younger daughters went to the store, leaving Billie-Jo at home. At the time of their departure, she was in the backyard, where she was painting the door, which was one of her homework assignments. She loved such activities, which gave her the opportunity to be outdoors, away from the noisy house, focusing on work. According to Zion's testimony, he and the girls returned home around 3:30 p.m. It was then that a terrible turn of events occurred that changed the lives of everyone involved. According to him, he entered the house after noticing that Billie-Jo did not respond to his screams. Alarmed, he went out to the backyard, where he found her lying on the ground next to the door she had painted earlier. The picture was terrible. Billie-Jo was lying in a pool of blood. Her face and head were badly damaged. A tent peg lay on the ground next to the body, which, as investigators later determined, became the murder weapon. Zion recalled later, "I saw her on the ground. I didn't understand what had happened. Everything was covered in blood. I was trying to do something, but I didn't know what it was." At that moment, according to Zion, he told his daughters to call an ambulance immediately, while he tried to give first aid to Billie-Jo. The police and paramedics who arrived at the scene could not help in any way. Billie-Jo was dead. Her death was violent and instantaneous, as evidenced by the nature and strength of the blows to the head. According to the first medical examination, the girl received at least 20 head injuries, which led to instant death from injuries. The police immediately began examining the crime scene. The yard was in chaos. Next to the body there were objects for painting, brushes, a can of paint, as well as the door itself, which was only partially painted. It is important to note that the crime scene was in the backyard, and access to it was limited on one side by the house, on the other by a high fence, which made outside penetration unlikely. This fact subsequently played a key role in the investigation. There were no obvious signs of the presence of unauthorized persons at the site. Having found no obvious evidence, such as shoe marks or fingerprints, the investigators turned their attention to the family itself. Zion Jenkins, as the man who discovered the body, was the first to be questioned in detail. However, at that moment he was shocked and claimed that he could not remember any details that could explain what had happened. Apart from family and a few friends, no one knew that Billie-Jo was alone in the backyard. This made it much more difficult to find possible witnesses or suspects. An important point was the question of how the killer could have entered the courtyard, inflicted such brutal blows, and disappeared without a trace. But so far these questions have remained unanswered. As the investigation began, Hastings was quickly filled with rumors and speculation. The locals were shocked by what had happened. This murder seemed unthinkable in a quiet neighborhood where such crimes were rare. Many wondered if someone could commit such a brutal murder in front of an entire family in their own home. Then what would happen next? Fear and suspicion grew, and the media attention only aggravated this condition. The first hours and days after the discovery of the body became critically important for the investigation. The police had to figure out who could have committed this crime as soon as possible. At this time, the growing panic among the residents of Hastings and public pressure demanded answers that no one could give yet. The first hours after the discovery of Billie-Jo's body were filled with chaos and anxiety. The police, who were called to the crime scene, immediately began work. Officers carefully examined the yard, the house, and the surrounding areas in search of clues that could shed light on what happened. But in the first few days it became clear that the investigation would face a number of difficulties. Access to the backyard was limited, and there were no obvious traces indicating an outsider who could have entered the territory. One of the first steps taken by the police was a detailed examination of the family members who were in the house. At that time, Zion Jenkins came under suspicion as the man who discovered Billie-Jo's body and was the first to call the police. The investigators drew attention to his behavior at the moment when he discovered his daughter, and to his subsequent testimony, which at first seemed not entirely consistent. When the police began questioning, Zion Jenkins was in a state of deep shock. He spoke in detail about how he returned home with his two younger daughters and found Billie-Jo's body in the backyard. However, his initial testimony raised questions for investigators. He claimed that he did not immediately understand what had happened and, in a panic, tried to help Billie-Jo, but the details of his actions remained uncertain. Investigators drew attention to the fact that Zion could not clearly explain why he did not notice the bloodstains on his clothes immediately after. According to him, he tried to bring Billie-Jo to consciousness. In addition, microscopic blood splatters were found on his clothes, which experts believed could have resulted from a blow to the victim. However, Jenkins insisted that these spots appeared when he bent over the body, trying to help his daughter. At this point, investigators began to examine his testimony in more detail, suspecting that he might have been involved in the murder. One of the police officers involved in the interrogations recalled Zion looked confused, but it was more than just shock. His answers were vague. He couldn't remember exactly what he was doing at that moment. It raised questions. The key evidence was the presence of small drops of blood on Jenkins' clothes, which, according to experts, could only have occurred in the immediate vicinity of the time of the strikes. This circumstance forced the investigation to focus on Zion as the main suspect. In parallel, a detailed examination of his movements on the day of the murder began. According to him, he left the house around 2:30 p.m. with his two younger daughters, and then returned around 3:30 p.m. when he found Billie-Jo. Investigators were examining the route of his trip to the store and checking the testimony of possible witnesses to determine if there were any discrepancies. On the one hand, his alibi seemed quite plausible. He was in full view of other people, shopping with his daughters. But on the other hand, the investigators had doubts about the accuracy of his time indicators. Did he have a period of time in which he could return home, commit a murder and leave the house again, while remaining unnoticed? Another important aspect concerned the peg itself, found next to Billie-Jo's body. This murder weapon was located on the territory of the house, and there were no traces indicating an outsider. This further reinforced the theory that the killer was someone who had access to the house. In addition, it turned out that on the day of the murder there were no extraneous sounds or movements in the yard that could attract the attention of neighbors or passers-by. As investigators continued to analyze Zion Jenkins' behavior, they encountered another problem. His reactions and responses during the interrogations became increasingly inconsistent. The police noticed that Zion sometimes got confused in his testimony, changed the details of the story, and could not clearly describe his actions at the time of the discovery of the body. These discrepancies began to arouse serious suspicions among investigators. Against the background of the absence of any other suspects or traces pointing to an outsider killer, Zion became the main object of their attention. Tension was also growing in society, and the press was increasingly focusing on the case. Soon, Zion Jenkins became a figure who was talked about everywhere his name flashed in the headlines. Discussions were conducted on television and in newspapers. The public's attention was focused on the issue: could a father have killed his adopted daughter? However, despite all the suspicions, there was not enough direct evidence against Jenkins to warrant an immediate arrest. The police continued to search for additional evidence, while delving into the analysis of his biography and the study of his psychological profile. The important question remained whether he had a motive for committing such a brutal crime. As the investigation continued, the public learned more and more about the identity of Zion Jenkins. He was a man with a good reputation, a teacher, respected in the local community. He was actively involved in the life of the city and engaged in charity projects. It seemed that he had no apparent reason to harm his adopted daughter. However, rumors that the relationship in the family was not as perfect as it might seem from the outside gradually began to surface.
He kicked the girls in the shins if they weren't behaving, or would punch them, or would just get very violent and very angry very quickly.
Some acquaintances of the Jenkins family mentioned that there were sometimes quarrels in the house, and Zion was a strict and demanding father. According to some, he may have been overly strict in parenting, which caused tension in his relationship with Billie-Jo. Despite this, There was no official evidence of serious conflicts in the family. As investigators began to study Jenkins' psychological state, trying to understand whether he could have been capable of such an act in a state of passion. His character, behavior, and possible ulterior motives all became the object of intense attention. However, more evidence was needed for an official prosecution. In the weeks following the murder of Billie-Jo Jenkins, the investigation focused on Zion Jenkins as the main suspect. Despite the fact that the evidence against him was circumstantial, suspicions were growing. The police continued to carefully check his alibi, study his psychological profile, and look for possible motives for the murder. However, the main evidence remained microscopic blood splashes on his clothes, the appearance of which the suspect could not immediately explain.
Was murdered. Sean Jenkins, her foster father, is arrested on suspicion of murder, and then he's formally charged on the 14th of March.
On March 28, 1997, 6 weeks after the murder, the police arrested Zion Jenkins. He was charged with the murder of Billie-Jo. The news of the arrest immediately spread throughout the country. Jenkins' family, friends, and colleagues were shocked. Many could not believe that a man with such a reputation could be capable of such a brutal crime. Some neighbors and family acquaintances expressed surprise at how quickly the police focused on one suspect, despite the lack of direct evidence of his guilt. The investigation presented its evidence. The main emphasis was on the fact that microscopic blood splashes on Zion's clothes could only appear at the time of the blows to Billie-Jo's head. In addition, an analysis of his behavior and confused testimony in the first days after the murder created a picture that, according to the investigation, indicated his involvement. However, the defense had its own explanation. Jenkins' lawyers argued that blood splashes could have appeared on his clothes when he bent over his daughter's body, trying to help. At the same time, the police could not find a direct motive that could explain why Zion would have killed his adopted daughter. None of the witnesses could pinpoint any serious conflicts between him and Billie-Jo that could have led to such a tragic outcome. All this made the case even more confusing, and in July 1998, the first trial of Zion Jenkins began. The parties were ready to present their arguments. The prosecutor's office focused on microscopic blood spatter, which, in their opinion, was a key piece of evidence. They claimed that Zion killed Billie-Jo in a moment of uncontrollable anger, possibly caused by a domestic quarrel or a sudden fit of irritation. However, this scenario remained hypothetical, as there was no concrete evidence that could explain his motive. Defense lawyers, in turn, tried to convince the court that microscopic blood splashes could have appeared on Jenkins' clothes when he bent over Billie-Jo's body for first aid, and Zion's behavior after the discovery of the body could be explained by a state of shock. They also stressed the lack of direct evidence of his guilt and inconsistencies in the investigation version. During the trial, the testimony of forensic experts was heard, whose conclusions varied significantly. Prosecutors argued that blood splashes could only appear in the immediate vicinity of the impact, and the defense insisted that it could have been secondary, when blood got on clothes from a body already lying on the ground. These disagreements created a situation in which the outcome of the case seemed uncertain. On July 2, 1998, after 6 weeks of hearings and consideration of all the evidence, the jury returned its verdict. Zion Jenkins was found guilty of the murder of Billie-Jo. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. This verdict caused a storm of emotions in the society. For many, this was a confirmation of justice, but not everyone believed in Jenkins' guilt. Jenkins' relatives and friends continued to insist on his innocence, and his lawyers immediately announced their intention to appeal. After the sentencing, Zion continued to claim that he was not involved in the murder. His family supported him, and the defense began to prepare a new round of court hearings, hoping to prove that the investigation had made mistakes and the conclusions of experts did not correspond to the real picture of events. Over the next few years, Jenkins' defense filed several appeals. One of the key aspects of the defense was challenging the accuracy of forensic reports related to blood splashes. In 1999, Jenkins' lawyers provided new scientific research that cast doubt on the prosecution's version that blood could have got on clothes only at the time of the murder. The first two appeals in 1999 and 2001 were rejected. However, an important turnaround took place in 2004. The judge of the Court of Appeal allowed the case to be reviewed on the basis of new data. These data included not only additional studies on blood on clothes, but also new witness statements that had not been previously taken into account. In late 2004, Zion Jenkins was released on bail pending a new trial. In 2005, the second trial began. This time, Zion Jenkins' defense was able to present new evidence that raised serious doubts about the credibility of the original accusation. Microscopic blood splashes were discussed again during this process. The defense argued that the conclusions of the first panel of experts were based on assumptions rather than solid scientific facts. Eventually, after the third trial, the court ruled that the charges against Zion Jenkins could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. He was finally acquitted and cleared of all charges. This decision was the culmination of years of litigation, leaving many questions unanswered.
But in the trial, no motive was ever established for why he would want to kill Billie-Jo.
After 3 trials, numerous appeals, and a review of evidence, the Zion Jenkins case has become one of the most discussed and controversial cases in modern UK jurisprudence. The acquittal verdict in 2006 left the public confused. Some saw this as a fair decision, while others, especially those who were close to Billie-Jo's family, remained convinced of his guilt. The trials, which spanned almost a decade, changed the lives of everyone involved once and for all, but left many questions. When the court finally cleared Zion of all charges in 2006, he was released after 6 years in prison. It was one of those rare cases when the accused, who had previously been convicted of such a serious crime, was not only released, but was also fully acquitted. However, his release was not a triumph. This event was overshadowed by doubts and controversy, both from the public and from the judicial system itself. After his release, Zion Jenkins faced many difficulties. Although he was officially acquitted, public opinion continued to be divided. Many people, including Billie-Jo's relatives, remained convinced of his guilt. In an interview after his release, Zion talked about how those 6 years had changed his life. He claimed that he was innocent from the very beginning, and that the struggle for justice had become a long and grueling process for him. It was a long-awaited victory, but it is bitter. I lost my family, my career, my reputation. I spent 6 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit, Zion said in an interview after his release. However, despite the acquittal, Jenkins' public life was forever changed. Shortly after his release, his marriage to Lois broke up. Lois, like many other family members, could not come to terms with what had happened, and their relationship was destroyed by long years of litigation. In an interview, she stated that although she recognized Zion's legal justification, she could not be sure of his innocence, and this created an insurmountable barrier between them. Despite the fact that Zion was acquitted, the investigation still had unresolved issues. Who really killed Billie-Jo? If Zion wasn't guilty, then the real killer is still at large. This fact continued to worry both investigators and the public. However, after Zion's acquittal, no new investigations or arrests followed, and the case gradually sank into oblivion. During the second and third trials, the police considered several other possible versions. One of the hypotheses was that the killer could be a certain tramp or a person with mental disabilities who happened to be nearby and attacked Billie-Jo. This version was supported by the testimony of some witnesses who saw suspicious people in the area of the Jenkins house on the day of the murder. However, this information did not lead to concrete results, and the police could not find convincing evidence to support this version. Another version considered by the investigation concerned the possible involvement of one of the teenagers who lived in the neighborhood, but it also did not receive sufficient support. As a result, none of the alternative theories were sufficiently substantiated to lead to an arrest or new charges.
He's declared that he wants to find out who murdered Billie, and then he will never talk about it again.
In addition, the Jenkins case has once again raised the question of how public pressure and media influence can influence lawsuits. From the first days of the investigation, the media actively covered the case, which, according to some experts, could put pressure on the investigation and the court. The press often portrayed Jenkins in a negative light, and many wondered if this had influenced the initial conviction. After his release and acquittal, Zion Jenkins tried to start a new life. However, as is often the case in such cases, his name continued to be associated with the Billie-Jo case, and this made it difficult for him to return to normal life. In 2010, he published an autobiographical book entitled Acquired But Not Free, in which he described in detail his experiences during the years spent in prison and his thoughts about the judicial system. The book provoked mixed reactions, but it became an important source of information about his view of the events that took place. Despite being acquitted, Zion continued to face public condemnation and distrust. Many residents of Hastings, where the murder took place, could not accept his innocence. For a long time, his name caused controversy and discussion, and this had a significant impact on his personal life. Zion also fought for compensation for wrongful imprisonment, but the British judicial system does not always meet such demands, especially if the issue of innocence remains controversial in the public consciousness. His compensation requests were rejected, which was an additional blow for him after years of fighting for his name. The story of the murder of Billie-Jo Jenkins and the subsequent trials remains one of the most complex and controversial in modern Britain. Despite the final acquittal of Zion Jenkins, this story has left deep scars both on the judicial system and on the lives of all the people involved. The most tragic thing about this story is that, despite years of investigations and trials, Billie-Jo's murder remains unsolved, and her family has never received a definitive answer to the question who really killed a 13-year-old girl on that February day in 1997? The Billie-Jo Jenkins case will forever be remembered as an example of a miscarriage of justice, but also as an unresolved tragedy that continues to disturb and raise questions. It was a reminder that in the pursuit of justice, one must be attentive to details, objective in assessments and prudent in conclusions.